Welcome to the Conquer Food podcast with Craig and Paula Williams, where we share tips, tricks and strategies from the coalface of the weight loss industry in the UK. We're going to help you to think, eat and move better. Ultimately, we're going to help you finally gain control and conquer food. Hey up and welcome to the first episode of this series of the Conquer Food podcast. It's been a while. It's been a while since since I've done a solo episode like this for a few different reasons. One, the fact that everyone has had little bouts of sickness, including me. And for the last probably 4 or 5 months, on and off, I've not felt great. I've not felt like I was kind of able to get on the microphone and do this kind of stuff, but I do now. I may at times have a little bit of a cough. I still have a little bit of residual sort of COVID and all that kind of stuff. So I might sometimes, if I get a little bit of a dry throat, start coughing. So there we go. So excuse me if I do that one. So today I want to answer a question which I get quite a bit, and that is food addiction a recognized addiction? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how you can check in on your own relationship with food, and we're also going to talk about if you really suffer in regards to your relationship with food, whether it seems to control you or you seem to have lost any kind of ability to moderate what you're doing and all that kind of stuff, then we're going to kind of talk about some of the ways you can tackle that and you can start to change what you're doing. Before we get into that, I just want to sort of raise your awareness of the new set. We've gone up a little bit. Our original set, which was in the bottom of our gym, used to get cold. Used to get quite cold in the winter, and that is another reason why we stopped doing regular episodes, because it was just absolutely freezing. To get guests in there was a bit of a nightmare. Whereas now we've changed the location, we've changed the set a little bit. Hopefully it's upped the production value a little bit, and therefore we're hoping that you'll enjoy it a little bit more. So that's what this is about. Coming up in the next couple of weeks, we've got some great guests to share their stories and to share their tips and advice. And I've also got a couple more of these solo type episodes planned where I kind of give you the benefit of my experience through working on the coalface of the weight loss industry, as like we say, and as a trainer, you get the benefit of that experience. All right, so food addiction, is it real? What do you think, first of all? If you are on YouTube right now, then obviously you've got the ability to comment below. So just comment below whether you think food addiction is a recognized thing or not, and then we'll kind of get into it. By the way, the things I'm going to talk about today, I've taken a lot of information from a website called examine.com. Now, examine.com doesn't sponsor this episode, or I don't have any kind of kickback from it or anything like that. It is my go-to website. Whenever if someone asks me questions about supplements, about nutrition, about sleep, about any health and fitness factor, I go to Examine and I just kind of read what it is. Now, what Examine does is it does a very good job of looking at all the research papers and evidence-based science that there is on a particular topic. And it kind of very good at summarizing it all and giving you like the facts or the outcomes, the interpretation of it. And it's completely unbiased. Which is very, very good. And it'll explain whether the tests have been done on rodents, or whether it's an epidemiological study, or whether it's peer reviewed and all this kind of stuff, or whether it's a study that's been done on humans, because we do differ from mice and rodents. Biologically, we're different, so it's not always relevant. If you've done a test on rats, well, that's not always relevant to human beings. Okay, so let's first of all define addiction. So as per the definition of addiction on the old tinterwebs, addiction is when a person compulsively engages in an activity despite negative consequences. Now, straight away, you start to think about some of the ways that you eat, some of the foods that you eat, some of the reasons why you eat, and you might already start to think, yes, food addiction is a real thing. And although we might think, it's very real, we feel it, we battle it, we try and tackle it every week, science doesn't actually recognize it as an addiction right now. Now, that may change in the future, but as it stands right now, it really doesn't see food addiction as a real thing. Of course, it's a real thing, but whether it's a real addiction. Okay, now that causes a few problems in regards to tackling it. And like I said, we can only hope that in the future, things like that will change. Now, the reason why I say it causes problems is because if it's not like really recognized in the medical world or the scientific world, then nobody's really working on effective like treatments for it or therapies for it or anything like that, because it's just not really a thing. Now, whether it's not been studied enough, whether it's not really understood enough, I don't really know. One thing I do know is it's the definition which kind of slows it down a little bit. So let me read again. Now, basically, what some researchers have done is they have mapped across what we call the DSM addiction criteria. So the DSM is a medical journal where they've defined what addiction is, and some people have mapped across those addiction criteria onto food. Okay, we're going to go through in a minute. They call it the Yale Food Addiction Scale. All right. So although in the world of science and all that kind of stuff, and I'm not a scientist, or I've not even been to university, they don't really recognize it as an addiction as per their publications. We do have a Yale food addiction scale. That tells me that things are moving kind of in the right direction. All right. So that's kind of good news. So what are the 7 features of addiction incorporated in the Yale food addiction scale? Let's go through them. And same again, I want you to sort of think about your relationship with food and how you eat, and tell me if these things resonate with you, what you think of it. So here we go. Number 1, the substance tends to be consumed in larger amounts or over longer periods than intended. Now, I speak to people every week where they have a certain type of binge food or a category of binge food, and they certainly consume that in much larger amounts than they're supposed to. I mean, I've experienced that myself. One of the things is obviously, if you think about like the average size of a chocolate purchase nowadays, when I was kind of growing up, it was a little chocolate bar, maybe a little bloody Freddo bar or something like that. Now you can get big slabs of chocolate, and we kind of kid ourselves, oh yeah, I'll save a bit for later, or I'll share it. Actually, we don't often do that, and we actually can the whole lot until we kind of feel sick. That first criteria, I'm sure, when you look at some of your eating and stuff like that, you meet that criteria already, and over longer periods than intended. All right, so you may have periods where you're kind of sitting, snacking on crisps and stuff like that, and it's meant for one sitting, but actually you just keep going and just keep going and just keep going. So that's the first one. Number 2, reducing time spent on important recreational, social, or work-related activities because of the consumption. All right, so you're missing out on things because you're spending time eating rather than actually doing those things. Like, going for a walk, you'll kind of sit in and have a binge, or, eat chocolate crisps, whatever it is, rather than do those things. Or you avoid going out on social events and then stay in and watch TV and eat naff food. So again, number 2, I'm sure a lot of you can kind of tick that off as something that you do quite regularly. Number 3, persistent desire or unsuccessful attempts to stop or curb consumption. Now, we've all had a bit of that, I think. I think we've all had times where we've tried to do something about it. We've tried to give these things up and to stop eating certain foods and really struggled. So number 3, probably big tick in the box again. Number 4 is continuing despite negative physical or physiological consequences, psychological consequences. So even though it gets us down, even though we become riddled with guilt, even though we know what we're doing is nowhere near moderation. Even though our waist size is getting bigger, it's getting harder to move around and harder to do the normal stuff that you do in life. Maybe it's even harder to sleep, or there's just a ton of physical and psychological consequences that we kind of put up with and eat these type of food and this amount of food despite all those things. So you can probably see a bit of a pattern. Number 5, spending a lot of time on activities related to consumption or recovering from consumption. Okay, so times when you spend a lot of time kind of trying to walk it off, or dwelling on it mentally, or you spend a lot of time kind of browsing online, looking online shopping, walking around the shop, spend a lot of time actually in the shops buying this kind of food as well as eating it. So that one's number 5. And number 6, needing more of the substance to achieve a desired effect. Now, we're probably going to talk about this in future episodes where, one of our big drivers in our mind is dopamine, which is often called the reward hormone. Actually, it's a bit of a motivation hormone where it'll cause us to chase stuff. Will cause us to chase the feeling we get when we've had binge food or chocolate food or overeaten or whatever it is. The thing is, the way that dopamine works is the more you kind of trigger it, the more receptors we develop in the brain. Therefore, the more we need to get a similar response in the future. So, that's another one. Again, probably you will all recognize. And then withdrawal. If you were to kind of cut back on it or cut it out completely, you experience some kind of withdrawal from it. Whether it's headaches, shakes, this feeling of longing. So they're the 7 addiction criteria that's been mapped across to food, okay, that they call the Yale Food Addiction Scale. Now, if you want to actually work through a questionnaire, you can do that on the website. So if you go to conquerfood.org, have a little dig around, you'll find the food addiction quiz and just sort of see where you score on that, and see what your results is. Now, what they say is if people experience 3 out of those 7 criteria, then there's a strong indication that you've certainly got an unhealthy relationship with food, but also, you have an addiction to food. And for some people, that can be like, nah, you can't possibly be addicted to food, Other people, they just know and accept it. There are some people that wear it with a badge of honor, and that's not great because it kind of suggests that you want to hold on to it and keep hold of it. What I really want to highlight today is there's a lot of people that don't think they really have an issue with it. They think they're kind of eating quite well and they don't understand why they're putting on weight or not getting any fitter and all this kind of thing. And it boils down to the fact that they have got some unhealthy relationships with food. They just don't quite understand it yet. So I encourage you to do that little Yale Food Addiction Scale and see where you are on that. All right, so just going back to the fact, whether it's recognized in the scientific world or not. The DSM, like I said, it's a medical publication, and it kind of lists a lot of disorders and illnesses and ailments and all this kind of stuff. Now, currently, it doesn't have a category for food addiction. This is what I mean by in kind of the medical world or whatever. They don't really recognize it as an addiction yet. I think everybody knows it it's there, it's out there, but it just... research, science, whatever, just hasn't caught up. Now, like I said, it may in the future. I think one of the problems is regarding sort of the definition of it. So, for example, it's quite hard to kind of define whether it's like a chemical addiction or whether it's a behavioral addiction, all right? Examples of the two is chemical addiction, drinking drugs, behavioral addiction, gambling. All right, so you're not actually consuming anything when you're gambling, but you do get a massive dump of dopamine, whatever, and that can cause like addictive type like behavior. Well, and it's the same with food. Is it the chemical addiction to food, or is it the behavioral addiction to food, or is it both? So I think there's a little bit of kind of work to be done in the science world to kind of work out actually what it is. And I think once that happens, we may well get a classification in the DSM. We may get a new category, or they might just kind of throw it in there when they kind of next update it. So I think it's got to come. Another reason why I think they might be dragging their heels a little bit is obviously if they define it that there is a problem with food addiction, something's got to be done about it. First and foremost, like we've got to find a culprit. We've got to find someone to kind of blame, whether it's the food industry, whether it's the nutritional science, which has always been questionable and has changed throughout the years. So there's a lot of questions to be answered on the back of sort of going, okay, right, actually, we're going to acknowledge there is a problem because now it needs to be dealt with. The other thing as well is it's huge. It's a huge, huge issue. Now, not everybody who is obese has got a food addiction problem, and everyone who's got a food addiction problem is obese, But having said that, there's lots and lots of people. We meet people, like I said, every week that really, really struggle with these things. So it is a huge problem. I mean, some kind of scientists and researchers, they are in the mind that like today's food and today's way of eating is far more like addictive, or triggers the brain's reward system far more than ancient food or even food from a few hundred years ago. And I kind of agree with that. I mean, just casting my mind back to when I was a little nipper, the way that I used to eat and how I used to eat and what we used to eat is very different from today. Very, very different from today. Certainly less refined processed foods, certainly less chemicals in the food, certainly less sugar. I think when I was growing up, we drank a lot of soft drinks. That was a real problem, but I think we've kind of cut back on that a little bit. That's a good sort of step that we've made over the last 20, 30 years. We've definitely reduced that a little bit. But having said that, we've also introduced some kind of hyper palatable food and drink, like people having a much smaller can of Red Bull compared to the amount of soft drink that we used to drink, but it's just a lot more packed with chemicals and sugars and caffeines and taurine and all this kind of stuff. So just going back to the Yale food addiction scale, I've got a couple of sort of percentages really. It was found that 5 to 10% of people in the general population had 3 or more of this criteria for food addiction. That's quite a lot, 5 to 10% of everybody. 15 to 25% of people with obesity had 3 or more of this criteria for the Yale food addiction scale. And 30 to 50% of people with severe obesity or binge eating disorders had, 3 or more. So numbers probably as you'd expect, really. Okay, but it's, for something that we don't quite recognize yet, there's quite a few people that have got these symptoms. So you might be thinking like, well, does it matter whether it's recognized or not? I think it does matter. It matters a hell of a lot. Like I said before, we're never going to get the real help that we need or further study or whatever until it is kind of recognized as an issue. And the other thing as well is like we're never going to expand medical therapies and treatments within the community until it's recognized, until it's actually a thing, and someone can say, what are you actually going to do with this bit of funding? I'm going to tackle this. And if it's not really there in the big book of everything, then that's not really going to happen, is it? And even going as far as to say like governmental policies and stuff like that, that's not going to change until it kind of is in there. So this is not a campaign to kind of get more research and all that kind of stuff on there, but it's just an interesting discussion point that even today, with something that we battle day in, day out, it's just not included in the book. It's kind of bizarre. All right, so you may be interested in like, these food addiction symptoms, can they be treated? Yes, we see people tackle these things all the time. The Yale food addiction scale is a test that we do when people start our long-term program, and we get them to do it again at the end. And there is a significant difference in the amount of those criteria that they can kind of tick off. So you can definitely treat it. Now, what I've got a number of the ways in which it can be tackled. All right. So there's this kind of six ways that kind of accepted and you can tackle it. But there are a few options. First of all, psychotherapy, whether it's CBT, anything like that, helps. Fundamentally, we're talking often about beliefs, about habit, how our brain works. And sometimes people overeat not necessarily because they're just greedy. Very rarely is it actually about that. It's because there's other stuff going on in their life, and food is that thing that they rely on to just make them feel a little bit better for one day of the week or for a slight moment that day or whatever, So there's normally a whole load of other things going on. People will mask these symptoms of trauma, unhealthy relationships, violent relationships. There's just a ton of stuff that food just becomes a coping mechanism, and therefore some kind of psychotherapy that can help to tackle some of those other things can be very, very effective. You start to peel away some of those layers, and the people's need to pacify themselves with food or whatever becomes a lot less. We see it all the time. Quite often people say to us when they come in our long-term program, I put on loads of weight and got really unhappy. And when we dive into it, actually it's the other way around, where people they get really unhappy for whatever reason and then start eating and pile on the weight. So that's the first one. Another one is abstinence-based programs, things like the 7-step program, like you would do at Alcoholics Anonymous or the drug one. These can be really, really helpful, where you're kind of just cutting it out. What we find is that it just creates a window in which you can break that chemical addiction to stuff. There's definitely chemical drivers to eating sugar, for example. There's definitely chemical drivers for eating refined and processed foods. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, all the time, it takes a while to break those chemical drivers, to even if it's just like it triggers so much dopamine that it takes a bit of time for the receptors to settle down and everything to kind of equalize and balance itself out, in order to not need, a great example is coffee. Recently, I cut out coffee completely for 180 days. I did in the end. And I was doing that because I was just drinking so much coffee. It was affecting so many aspects of my life. And at times, it was making me depressed. And it was making me depressed because I'd created all these dopamine receptors because, this is how caffeine works. It settles in the dopamine receptors, then you need more receptors, therefore you need more caffeine, and then you need more and more. And it becomes this vicious circle until eventually, you have massive bouts of depression because you just cannot trigger enough dopamine to fulfill the need of the receptors. And when you cut it out for 10 to 30, 90 days or whatever, those receptors kind of die off a little bit, and your dopamine response settles down to how it was at first, like a dopamine detox almost. So, these abstinence-based programs are really, really effective in just resettling all that. And there's times when we've had someone completely cut out sugar and then drink something like Coca-Cola, which they would drink quite a lot before they come on the program. And it's like, Jesus, that's sweet. They just didn't realize how sweet it was because their taste buds and their reward response in the brain was just jacked up. Energy restriction and other weight loss diets. When you start to restrict the amount of energy you're consuming, the amount of food you're consuming, it will change your relationship with food, because you just won't have free reign to eat whatever, however, whenever you want, and that can have a dramatic effect. And then residential programs. Now, we talk about residential programs. Ours is a residential program. We run a 12-week Conquer Food program. There are shorter programs as well, but that's the one we kind of really advocate the most, just because of the way it's been developed. And the beauty about like a residential program like that is all those 4 things that I've covered are part of that residential program. That's the kind of the power of it, There's 2 other things that you can use to kind of help with food addiction criteria and symptoms and all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, we don't cover these in the residential program. One is medication. We don't use medication because we're not doctors or anything like that, but there are some medications out there that can help. There's a couple of things there which have been developed to kind of help with sugar cravings and overeating, turning off your appetite. We don't do anything with that kind of stuff because when you get the first 4 things sorted out, it's not often needed, So and we're not doctors or like that, so we can't go prescribing stuff. But that is a way that people use. And then the final one is bariatric surgery. Now, in my experience, it may help with the symptoms or the consequences of food addiction and overeating. But I know plenty of people that have had bariatric surgery and have come on our program just to tackle the beliefs, the processes, the habits and all that they've got. So it doesn't often help with that. In fact, what can happen quite regularly is it actually has a detrimental effect and forces you to do more of the behavior that meets the criteria for food addiction, because you start to cheat your way around stuff. Like before, you could just eat biscuits. Now you physically cannot consume enough biscuits, so you start dissolving it in your tea and all this kind of thing, and it can actually make it a little bit worse. But it's one of the recognised methods of tackling food addiction criteria. So, it's there on the list. Okay, so a couple of interesting things there, a couple of interesting points. If you want to continue the conversation after this, we have a private Facebook group where there's only people associated with the Conquer Food program in there. You can go to Facebook and search Conquer Food, and then you'll be able to find the group. Failing that, you can send us a message and we'll send you a link to get you in that group. I hope that have kind of been interesting to listen to. I think there's some good information in there. Like I said, head over to examine.com. They've got a load of articles and stuff like that on weight loss, fitness, on supplements and dieting, just a ton of different stuff. And it's really good because, like I said, it summarizes it all and puts it across in often a very, simplistic way. And we know that certain bits of research and certain bits of and certain experiments, they're a little bit biased because people have got an interest in what they're trying to do. But this examine.com is just completely unbiased. It's got no reason to to cook the books. Excuse the pun. Oh yeah, there it is. Theme music. It's been so long, I forgot which one it was. Anyway, I found it. So thanks for listening, and make sure you tune into the next episode of the Conquer Food podcast, where we're going to be going through more food addiction, refined fast food tips and advice. So see you then.